Welcome to Faithfully Making You and Your Voice Count. This is part of Tuesdays for Nurture, which are the occasional Tuesday webinars as a part of the Thursdays for the Soul series, where we focus on education for the people of God. From topics from faith-filled politics to how-tos in congregational life to the impacts of current realities on the life of the church will be featured. Each webinar will include clear suggestions on what you can do to change the church and the world towards the world that God imagines for us. I am your host, Reverend Dr. Chris Davies, and this is offered through Justice and Local Church Ministries of the United Church of Christ. So I know that today we're going to talk about the census and voting and all of these things that are incredibly political. I know that some of you are watching us as we go, and some of you are watching the recording thereafter. And I know that one of the things we hear most clearly is keep the politics out of the pulpit. Now, we've got all sorts of things to say about that in the United Church of Christ, and particularly from our DC office, which does the kind of intentional politicking that is faith-filled, because we know that Jesus is full of politicking and politics. That so much of what Jesus calls for is things that would now be considered political in discourse for people. So introducing the director of our DC office, Sandy Sorensen, who will be leading this conversation. Hi, Sandy.
Thank you, Chris. And thank you, everyone who's joining us this afternoon. We're grateful to have you with us and this really important conversation about the 2020 elections and the 2020 census. As Chris said, I'm Sandy Sorensen, and I'm the director of the United Church of Christ, Washington, D.C. Public Policy Advocacy Office. And we work with all settings of the United Church of Christ, as well as secular and interfaith partners, to bring about a public policy lens that reflects a just world for all. The UCC has long viewed voting rights and fair elections as a foundational civil rights issue, and therefore a faith issue. Since 2004, the UCC has engaged in the Our Faith, Our Vote campaign, promoting voter registration, issue education, and voter mobilization and voter protection. We are also part of an interfaith coalition called Faithful Democracy. And I'm delighted to be joined on this webinar by several of my Faithful Democracy Coalition partners. We work together across interfaith denominational lines to promote voter rights and voter advocacy. So I'd like to introduce our panelists, and then I'm going to begin our conversation with a little, to pick up a little bit about what Chris talked about earlier, about the connection between faith and politics. But I first want to introduce my panelists, wonderful colleagues, and I'm grateful to have them here today. We have Christian Brooks. Christian is the representative for domestic issues of the Presbyterian Church USA, Office for Public Witness. We have also with us Sister Quincy Howard, who is with Network, a Catholic social justice lobby, and she is the government relations advocate. And then finally, last but definitely not least, we have Katie Adams, who is our policy advocate for domestic issues in the United Church of Christ, Washington, D.C. office. So I'm going to get us started to talk a little bit about the connection between faith and politics. So the 2020 census and the 2020 elections may be, for some people, realms that should be separate. And so I want to talk a little bit about why we feel like those are connected. What I often tell people is that when you look through the scripture, you look through both Hebrew and Christian scripture, there's so much scripture that talks about how do we order our common life? How do we live together? And really that is what politics is. is about how we order our common life. And the prophets remind us, sometimes very strongly, that when we are not in right relationship with each other and with creation, then we are not in right relationship with God. And so therefore, the way we order our common life is a faith issue. And that means that the 2020 elections and the 2020 census, which help us to order our common life, are faith issues. And so I want to just begin by asking each of our panelists to talk a little bit about why they see not only should we or can we connect faith and politics, but we should. And why do faith voices matter in this conversation about the 2020 elections and the 2020 census? So Christian, let's start with you.
Thank you, Sandy. And thank you so much, Chris, for that wonderful start. At the Presbyterian Church USA, we hear a lot of the keep the politics out of the pulpit speak, right? But, we can't. And there's so many different reasons as to why we can't, but I will focus on one, and it's basically those things impact us. Right. So when we are thinking about different policies that are being passed, they impact everybody that's here within the United States. And those people are also in our churches. And if we're really going to say that we love our neighbor, and if we're really going to speak to the very essence of someone's soul, we have to speak to issues that impact them, right? We have to speak to issues of homelessness, because guess what? There are people who are in our congregations who are homeless. We have to speak to issues of food security. We have to speak to issues of gun violence, voter suppression, all of those different things, because all of those different things impact the people who are sitting in our in our congregations, the people who we love. But we should not only speak to those issues, but we have a duty as Christians to advocate, right? Because it's one thing to acknowledge something that somebody is going through. It's another thing to take a step forward and try to alleviate whatever that issue is. And, as we are trying to continue to build community with people, as we are trying to speak to people's soul, to who they are, to the issues that they're going through, we have to also take action and speak out against and try to alleviate the different problems that are going on. But also, our faith is a part of who we are. Wherever we go, we take our faith with us, whether we are going into a job in ministry or whether we are going into a job in the secular world, so to speak. We take our faith as a part of who we are, our very internal being, into those different spaces. And to try to remove that would be removing a piece of ourself, and it will also be doing a disservice.
That's so true, Christian. I really appreciate that. The fact that there's no way really that we can say we love our neighbor if our neighbor is being impacted by unjust housing policy, or if our neighbor is being impacted by unjust healthcare policy. So it's so true, Christian. We can't say we love our neighbor and not be involved in politics. I would make the distinction, though, between politics and partisan. One of the things that I talk about with people a lot of times is that the two are not the same. Politics is about the way we order our common life and the policies that we agree to come together and live under. Partisanship is a particular ideology. And one of the great things I think that the faith community brings to a conversation about politics is that our special interest is the common interest. And that's very unusual. Quincy, I wanted to pose the same question to you. Why do faith voices matter in this conversation?
Thanks, Sandy, and it's so good to be here. I think coming from an organization that is based on Catholic social justice values, just to give a little context about that, we network lobby for Catholic social justice. Our politics grow out of really a movement that started in the Catholic Church with the Industrial Revolution, as leaders in the church started seeing how workers in particular, were really being slowly killed by a system that didn't recognize their human dignity and their value and didn't respect that. That is what Catholic social teaching grew out of. So at the core of our advocacy work, which is very similar for all of our organizations, is really the respect for human dignity, as well as human life having value, the highest value. And I think one of the important things that the faith community has to contribute to conversations of politics is to continually inject those factors into the conversation, because so often politics can become just a headspace of debate and, well, what if, and conditional statements about things that are really impacting people's lives on a fundamental foundational level. And that can often get, what is it, the forest lost for the trees, right? And the priorities can all of a sudden be backwards or upside down because we get so lost in the debate that we forget about the things that really matter. So I think it is crucial that faith advocacy is part of the conversation and continually injects those factors into what really matters.
Great. Thank you, Sister Quincy. Katie, for you, why do faith voices matter in this conversation?
It's so great to be here. Thank you so much. And my fellow esteemed panelists have said just beautiful words. I couldn't agree any more with them. You know, who we are as people of faith is inextricably linked to kind of our public and civic lives. And the more we're able to see those interconnections, the better that we're able to really truly love our neighbor and love God. And so I just always encourage people to find a thing that they're passionate about in kind of their daily lives. You know, do you work at a food bank, or do you help with homelessness, or, you know, what is the thing that you do, and see how you can kind of impact on a broader level. How can that thing that you're doing down on the ground, because faith communities are so good at, you know, really reaching into communities, and then, you know, how do you really amplify that doing advocacy? And, you know, one more thing I'll say is that our faith communities are right there with vulnerable people, and standing in solidarity and standing with them. And so it's so important that we go to the people who are in power and we say, you know, these are the people in our communities and we care about them, because they are our community. And so I think that it's that's the whole story.
Thank you, each of you, so much for that, giving us that really solid foundation that connects our faith to our political life. And that will lead us right into our conversation now about the impact of COVID-19 on the 2020 elections and the 2020 census. And, you know, I know that the elections and the census, given everything that is going on in the midst of this pandemic and all the things that everyone is trying to juggle, may seem very, very far away. But the truth of the matter is that all the things that we're dealing with right now in the midst of this pandemic are related to who we put in office in November and whether or not people are counted and where federal funding goes. So even though it seems like a far off thing to think about the elections and the census right now, and I know it's a challenge when you're, you know, juggling childcare and work from home and all these things, but ultimately the decisions that we make around filling out the census form and the decisions we make at the polling booth in November are going to impact the things that we're going through now. So before I begin with the first question, I just want to invite everyone to use the Q&A box if any questions arise, and we'll leave some time at the end for your questions. Please don't put them in the chat box. So we don't want to overlook them. We want to make sure we get all the questions. So I'm going to begin with you, Christian. So long before COVID-19, we had been struggling with a history of legacy of injustice in the United States around the right to vote. And in recent years, we have seen accelerated efforts by states to institute laws that restrict voting access and suppress the vote, especially for marginalized and vulnerable communities. Can you talk a little bit about those challenges and how now the COVID-19 pandemic factors into the 2020 elections?
Absolutely. Let me make sure I unmuted myself. Okay. Can you hear me? Okay, great. So, yes, voter suppression has been a real issue within the United States for a very, very, very long time. As we know, there was a point in the United States where people who look like me didn't have the right to vote for several reasons. One, because I'm Black, and two, because I'm a woman. So, people of color and also women did not have the right to vote. And, there was a lot of advocacy to get those rights in place. So the 15th Amendment was passed, but that specifically granted voting rights to African American men. And then after the 15th Amendment was the 19th Amendment, which granted voting rights to women. However, because there is no universal voting, there's no universal voting rule, so to speak, in the US Constitution, states found a way around the 15th Amendment in particular and instituted a large number of very egregious voting rights tactics. So we know about the Jim Crow South. And in the Jim Crow South, how there were a lot of terrible things that were happening in an effort to keep Black Americans out of the voting rolls, right? So there were threats of violence, beatings, lynchings, loss of properties, jobs, things of that sort. And there was a fight, the civil rights movement, the fight for Black Americans to vote. So the Voting Rights Act passed in 1965. And this was a pivotal moment for all people of color, honestly, but particularly Black Americans who have been facing some pretty nasty voter suppression tactics. However, this victory was short-lived because in 2013, the Supreme Court ruled Section 4B of the Voting Rights Act unconstitutional. And once this happened, a host of voter suppression tactics came about. So we see very strict ID laws, voter purges, where people are being completely deleted from voting rolls. These are people who have registered to vote. However, for some reason, they have now been deleted from the rolls. People are being asked to provide proof of citizenship. So they're actually being asked to bring their birth certificate with them when they're trying to vote. You have restrictions on voter registration. So a large way to disenfranchise voters is felon disenfranchisement. So if someone has a felony in certain states, they are not able to vote. And then you have issues with limiting early voting and absentee voting opportunities. So all of these issues really started to amass after the 2013 Supreme Court ruling. And a very interesting film that I recently came across with the Faithful Democracy community is Suppressed, the Fight to Vote. And within that video, it shows a lot of the different voter suppression tactics that have taken place within the 2018 Georgia midterm election. So I definitely recommend that you all go and watch that film. But voter suppression has been going on for a long time. And then we have COVID-19, right? So people are scared to go outside. People are scared to go outside, and justifiably so, because we just hit over or at least 1 million people in the United States who have been confirmed for COVID-19. And then we also have people who are dying at high rates of COVID-19. So this is it's very dangerous to go outside. However, we saw with Milwaukee with their primary election, or Wisconsin rather, with their primary election, they didn't extend absentee voting. So people had to go and vote. However, in Milwaukee, particularly, they had about 180 voting stations in 2016. You know how many they had on April 7th? 5. They had 5. So people were going out, standing in these extremely long lines in order to be able to vote. And we know, because we've seen so many statistics, that in Milwaukee, particularly, it's an epicenter for people of color to not only contract COVID-19, but also to die of COVID-19, right? So that adds an extra layer of fear and fear mongering to suppress the vote of people of color. So this fight to have more absentee voting, and to really reinvent, so to speak, our voting system, as we are in unprecedented times. We are experiencing something that we have not experienced before in the United States, is very important, because there are a lot of people who won't get to exercise their civic duty to go out and vote, or their right to go out and vote, just because they are afraid of contracting this disease, right? So we're in a situation again where people, particularly people of color and people with low income, have to choose between their life or voting. And this just really makes me think about this really makes me think about things that were going on before the Voting Rights Act, right? Because then people were choosing between their lives and voting. And we're here again, as a country that is continuing to develop and continuing to learn through this pandemic. We have to grow from this. We have to grow, and we can't continue to be in this space where one, voter suppression is even a thing, but two, where someone has to choose between their own physical health and exercising their right to an opinion in the democratic system.
Yeah, that is so absolutely true, Christian. And you point to one of the ironies of voting rights advocacy work, is that many of the things now that we're advocating for in the midst of COVID-19 to make the elections safe and fair are things that we've advocated for a long time. Extended early voting, same day registration, having the election day be a national holiday, having it being spread out over a week. All these things that we have been advocating for many, many years now, it's interesting that they're kind of coming into play. And so the constriction of our voting rights that we've seen over the years is now really hindering us in this time of COVID-19. And we're having to rethink some of our approaches to election law and election practices. And so, Christian, you brought up the topic of Wisconsin, and I want to pose this question to Sister Quincy. As Christian was saying, we saw pictures of people standing in lines, spaced apart 6 feet, wearing masks, wanting to cast their vote in Wisconsin. We also heard stories about people who had requested absentee ballots and then never got them and didn't get them in time to be able to vote. And so I know that there are a number of voting rights groups, including our very own Faithful Democracy, that are advocating for some changes in the election process to make sure that in November, in the 2020 elections, that they are both safe and fair. And so Quincy, could you talk a little bit about some of those measures?
Yeah, sure. Thanks for the question. I would like to just reiterate how Wisconsin really provided us with a cautionary tale for how badly elections can go wrong, especially when there isn't sufficient preparation, when there's confusion and discord, and particularly when politics put voters in danger. I would also like to lift up how inspired I was by the response of the Wisconsin voters, including some of my own octogenarian sisters, Dominican sisters, who, as Sandy said, did not get their absentee ballots in time. And so they went to the polls and waited for hours to be able to cast their ballots. So there is the inspiring aspect of how voter turnout really surpassed any of the expectations. But there, unfortunately, are also the horrifying results that we're beginning to hear about now of a bump in COVID cases as a result of poll workers and voters being exposed to the virus. So I want to keep all of the Wisconsinites in prayer for their success and their continued travails for what went down in their state. Exercising the right to vote should not have life or death stakes and in a pandemic, and it doesn't need to. There are steps that can be taken by states and localities. It requires planning and it requires preparation so that elections are not driven by confusion, partisan politics, and discord like we saw in Wisconsin. We know what those steps are. And we still, fortunately, have time before, in the next 200 days before the general election, that we can begin taking these steps and making these preparations. We know what they are. The first step, however, in having that process begin in earnest is to get federal funding. And we need federal funding now. There is a clear role for our federal government to step in and provide funding that is desperately needed by states and localities, election officials and jurisdictions to carry out the upcoming primary and general election in the way that they need to be run for public safety and voting rights to be upheld. I would say that Congress did a great job in the CARES Act, which they passed last month. It was really a bipartisan success story of Congress showing that they can, in fact, respond to a pandemic. And it did even include $400 million for election protection funding. That seems like a lot of money, but it's really just a fraction of the estimated costs that are going to need to be covered to make sure that elections are fair and safe. What is the estimated need from Congress to states and localities is $4 billion in the next COVID response package. That sounds like a lot again. However, to put that in perspective, that's really only 0.2% of the total price tag of that CARES Act that was passed last month. So if you ask me, that seems like a bargain to protect our democracy and make sure that we are able to carry out the next election with confidence and to maintain the confidence of the electorate in that process. So there's funding that's needed. That is really only the first step. That is the start, which is why it needs to happen now. There is broad agreement about what the necessary measures are for states and localities in order to run safe, fair elections in a pandemic. Some of the basics are no excuse absentee voting, which essentially means that people are not forced to leave their homes, the safety of their homes, and sheltering in place in order to cast a ballot. That is a fundamental requirement, is to have any person, any voter, have the ability to vote by mail, which of course goes without saying that that would mean a large increase in mail-in ballots. Another thing that is needed is to maintain safe and accessible in-person voting. This means having polling places for the people who, for whatever reason, are not able to mail in their ballots. We know that there can be confusion around absentee ballots. We know that there is likely to be a lot of dislocation of people over the coming months due to economic hardship. And it's crucial that voters maintain access to a polling place, and that polling place, that the polling workers are kept safe, that the facility itself is clean and hygienic, and that all of the measures are taken to protect public health in that process. Another measure would be expanded early voting. This is a no-brainer. This just means that you are spreading out the amount of time that voters can come in and cast their ballot in person. And what this does is it limits the crowds at polling places. We're told that we're not supposed to be congregating. We don't know in November what conditions are going to be, but it's likely that we're not going to want to have large crowds, and expanded early voting allows people to come in early and spread out when people are going to the polls. Another measure that is recognized as being very helpful is online and same-day registration, because we know that that is a crucial step in your voting rights, and often takes place in facilities like DMVs where there are a lot of people and it's public. So if there's a way that we could either have registration happen when you cast your ballot or let it be online, then these are measures that could allow people to feel safe and also exercise their right to vote. I also just want to add that protecting the 2020 primaries and general election is not a partisan issue. Clearly it's political, but it is not partisan. We know that 72% of US adults support a requirement for mail-in ballots in a pandemic, and that includes 65% of Republicans. We have election officials all across the country, state and local jurisdictions, that are fully on board with the idea of mail-in ballots. Mail-in ballots have been part of our democratic systems and our elections. They're integral to it. And it doesn't matter what party these election officials are, they recognize that it's a good idea in the current circumstances. So faithful democracy has essentially become singularly focused on pushing back against the partisan narrative that is emerging. We see ourselves as a good messenger particularly for Republicans in the Senate, which are key at this moment as we're looking at passing another package, to recognize that this is not a Republican or a Democratic issue. This is an American issue. And this is an issue of the fundamental health of our democracy in a very unstable time. So our multi-faith coalition, a lot of our partners are here right now. We are pushing to have the $4 billion in funding included in the next legislative package, as well as all of the priorities that I laid out for how elections should be run in order to keep voters safe.
Thank you, Quincy. And that underscores what I've been hearing quite a bit, is that what we need is to have multiple access points right now for people to be able to cast their vote. Not every particular system works well for every community. For example, mail-in voting for some disability rights communities is not the most accessible way for them to cast their vote. And so we know many ways that we can make voting safe and accessible for people. And really, as you point out, there's really no reason why we can't offer those multiple avenues so that people don't have to risk their health to cast their vote. But we clearly need to do more work with our bringing our antiquated and inadequate election system up to speed so that we can really handle the challenge of the COVID-19 pandemic. I want to pivot now to the Census 2020. We were hearing quite a bit about that at the beginning of the year. And then, of course, with the outbreak of COVID-19, that kind of fell by the wayside. Katie, I'm hoping that you can talk to us a little bit about why is the census even more important now, really, in the time of COVID-19? And how is it being impacted by the pandemic? And what are the things that we can do as justice advocates, as faith-based advocates, to make sure that everyone is counted in the 2020 census, and especially vulnerable communities that might be more likely to be overlooked in the midst of the pandemic?
Great, thank you so much, Sandy. So as I'm sure you all have heard, the Constitution requires every 10 years that a census be conducted to record every person living in the United States. And I get really jazzed about the census. I know not a lot of people don't know why, but there's a lot at stake. And so really quickly, I just want to go over what's at stake. A fair and accurate count will result in the equitable distribution of federal funds, over $800 billion in federal funds. It also means an equitable and just representation in the House of Representatives. So if you followed the census over the past couple years, you might have already seen that it's been a struggle. Advocates have been making sure that it's fully funded, have been making sure that it's not conducted in a political way. I'm sure a lot of people remember the administration tried to put a citizenship question on the census, which unsurprisingly turned out to be a blatantly political move. So the census was kind of gearing up to go into full swing on April 1st, when turns out all of us had to be in our houses, or a lot of us had to. And so the census is having to make a pretty significant pivot. So right now, a little over 50% of the country has taken the census, and that's through kind of the traditional, you got something in the mail with a code on it and you filled it out online. And so that's actually pretty on par with what it looked like 10 years ago for people taking the census, when actually a lot fewer people could do it online because that wasn't really an option. So as I've said, the Bureau is statutorily required, to the best of their ability, to count every person living in the US, no matter what. So in past years, doing that meant sending a lot of people out into, like, just real life people out to every door to knock on doors. And that's not possible right now because it's not safe for communities. It's not safe for people to be out in communities. And so people who have been traditionally undercounted and are hard to reach, including those in very urban or very rural areas, communities of color, impoverished communities, Native American tribes, children and the elderly, undocumented workers, people with disabilities, and immigrants, huge swaths of the population are going to be harder to reach. So the census has asked Congress to change some of the statutory deadlines. So saying, hey, can we take a little bit longer to do this? And of course, everyone's like, yeah, absolutely. Really important to make sure that everyone is kept safe. But what we as advocates really have to keep in mind is that a fair and accurate count must be conducted because, like I said, there's a lot of money at stake and there's congressional representation at stake. And the thing is, COVID has brought into really stark relief the importance of an accurate census. Census data impacts the planning and funding for hospitals, clinics, emergency preparedness, healthcare funding, school lunches, all of these vital programs that are part of our very patchy, very underfunded social safety net are part of what the census count and census money goes into. And so it's a real sticky wicket, sorry, I don't know where that came from, because we're having a hard time getting a good count, but the best count possible is important. And so as advocates, we're talking to the Census Bureau and saying, you need to be creative and you need to be thoughtful in how you do this. You can't just say, oh, I'm so sorry, this time it just didn't work out. We'll do better in 2030. And so when looking at the time frame, you know, I think that that's where we're really saying, sure, adjust the time frame, but you can't just truncate the census entirely. I really quickly want to kind of say why it's important for people of faith to care about the census. You know, advocating for an accurate census is an act of faith. It is saying that every person has dignity and humanity. And so, you know, the way that we can love our neighbor, which is something, you know, obviously we talk about a lot, is making sure that our neighbor is counted. So while the online portion of the census and mailings remain largely unchanged, people going out to the community has been made very difficult. And so the non-responses that the census gets, they're going to have to, like I said, try new and flexible ways to respond. As advocates, we're asking for a couple of things. We're saying, hey, get everyone you know to fill out the census who can online. So if you haven't done it, fill out your census right now. Ask your friends, ask your neighbors safely and using social distance, so online, but say, hey, everyone, please fill out the census and say why it's important to you. And the United Church of Christ, we have a live action alert right now, which has information about links, which we'll be able to send out. So how do you tell people how to sign up for the census? And then if you're interested, there are also ways to host like a Zoom tutorial on how to fill out the census if people have questions in your community. So there's a lot of resources, again, that we've provided for through partners on how to help congregations and communities fill out the census. And then finally, it's asking Congress to say, sure, we definitely need to be safe, we need to be thoughtful, but the Census Bureau has to commit to being transparent and agile and flexible in committing to new ways of counting hard to reach populations without just giving up on it entirely. And so we have an action alert, like I said, that's live. So you can ask your member of Congress, make sure that the census is done in a fair and accurate way. So I hope you guys are all as excited about the census as I am now. That's that, Sandy.
Thank you, Katie. I am excited about the census. And I have to say that I filled out my census form online and it took less than 9 minutes. And so you can think of it as 10 minutes for the next 10 years, 10 minutes of your time to impact the next 10 years.
Ooh, that's good, Sandy.
I really hear like two sort of pieces coming out of what you said, Katie. One is that right now we do have 3 ways of responding to the census. So even though it will be difficult for many communities, there are still 3 ways to respond: online, on phone, by phone, and on paper.
Yep.
And then the second one is a message that I heard coming out of your comments, Katie, was that the other thing is that we have to be vigilant. We have to make sure that we are watching the Census Bureau, making sure that they are finding ways to count marginalized and vulnerable communities, hard to count communities. So we have to make sure that we are sort of like the watchdogs in many ways of the Census Bureau, and making sure that Congress exercises its oversight to make sure that count happens, and it happens accurately and everyone is counted.
Absolutely, Sandy. Those are you ably articulated the points that I was laying out.
So at this point, maybe let's see, turn to questions. Are there any questions in the Q&A box for our panelists today?
It looks like there is one question about how do we faithfully witness to justice and equity when so many of the obstacles seem to be partisan?
I think I'll take a stab at it, and then I'm going to turn it over to the panelists. But there actually are a lot of avenues to advocate for justice that don't have to be partisan. And that's actually the great gift of the faith community, is that we come to these issues with a view of right relationship in human community and right relationship in creation. I mean, our public policy platform, our sort of our party platform, if you will, as a faith community, is the vision God laid out in the scripture for human community and for creation. And so just bringing that voice and that vision really allows us to be an important justice voice while not being a partisan voice. I think it's also important to say that in conversations around these issues, so important to remember to build those bridges, just to tell your own stories and to speak from your own story, to humanize these issues. It can be really tempting to kind of to set up an adversarial conversation with someone who might disagree with you on the issues. But I found that sometimes when we tell our story, we start with our story. Why do I believe this? Why do I think this? Why have I come to this? We can have conversations that do lead to less partisan outcomes and really kind of bring us to solutions for the problems that are facing us. Panelists?
Yeah, I would say that you really hit the nail on the head, Sandy, and thank you so much for doing so, because so many times when we are out fighting for justice and equity, the issues that we are fighting for become seen as partisan issues and not human rights issues, right? So we have to control our own narrative and not let that narrative be placed upon us. What we are fighting for is the humanizing of people, the humanizing of people and their rights and equality. And as we are fighting for these things, I don't think that it's we can't go into this fight with, okay, I need to be on either this side or this side, because in all actuality, you need both sides in order to make change. You need both sides in order to institute just policy and just law. So I definitely think that Sandy hit the nail on the head in saying that, we're fighting for humanity, and partisanship is not something that we're focused on, and we really have to take back our own narrative and not let that narrative of being with a particular political party be placed upon us when we are fighting for things that we know people need.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
I would only add that is also spot on, and it is a struggle. But I would add that, I think that the partisan narrative is presented in a way that makes it seem starker than it is in actuality around the country. I think that that there's a lot more common ground among people, not necessarily politicians, but people. That often isn't recognized when on what you hear on the evening news or in whatever election campaign commercial, right? It makes it seem like it is all either or. And from my perspective, I really lean towards individual relationships and believe that those changes in people's hearts happen by a slow process of conversion and helping them to understand this is not a partisan issue that I'm talking about. I am not telling you about this from the perspective of a Democrat or a Republican, and I'm not setting myself up to be adversarial with you. And you help people see those nuances through example and through relationship. So that really is the place that I find hope when it comes to my advocacy work, is from individual relationships.
Thank you, Sister Quincy. Do we have any other questions? Chris? So I'd like to conclude by just going around the circle of our wonderful panelists, and thank you again so much for being here. And I hope that this panel can demonstrate for our UCC listeners the importance of interfaith partnerships in doing the work of justice, and that in Washington, there are many, many faith-based advocacy communities and organizations, and it's important to know that we work together all the time. We swim in interfaith waters all the time, and so it can really happen, and hopefully it will happen on a local level as well. So I'd like to go around. Christian, we'll start with you. What's one thing that you would like people to take away from this webinar?
So we've heard a lot of good stuff on this webinar, and I'm so happy to be here with such amazing speakers. But one of the most important things that I would like for people to take away from this webinar is the power of information. So while we are here and we work on Capitol Hill, so we're getting all of this good information, a lot of people on the ground aren't. So as we are asking for advocacy, it's important to just inform people of what's going on, inform people about their rights. That's number one. Number two, inform people about things like the census. Katie gave a great overview of the census, how to take the census, informing people of those things, especially communities of people that are historically undercounted, and also historically have their votes suppressed, because one of the most powerful tools that can be used to oppress someone is to just take away information. It doesn't matter how many policies we pass and how great the policies are. If people don't know their rights, and if people don't know the information that's out there, then they can still be oppressed. So just the basic understanding of information, not taking for granted access to information, and making sure that things like this webinar is getting to the people who need to hear it is very important.
Mm-hmm. That's absolutely. So a very clear call to be information bearers in our communities. Sister Quincy, what's one thing that you would like folks to take away?
I think the framing of issues like the election and the census as being rooted in a deeper truth. These are not partisan issues, and to resist the temptation and the narrative to turn them into partisan issues. I believe that the underlying truth of both of these systems that is so crucial has to do with our Constitution. And people can come back to the values of our Constitution and know that when they advocate for safe and effective elections, as well as a census that counts all people, which it is supposed to do, that they are right and that it is not partisan.
Thank you, Sister Quincy. Katie,
Okay.
over to you. What's one thing you'd like people to take away?
So I would love for you to, as soon as you get off this webinar, to go to census.gov and fill out your census if you haven't already, and then make a census plan if you are able to, and then talk to the people in your life that you care about, so your community and your family and your friends and your congregation, and ask them if they have a census plan and whether or not they're going to fill it out. And don't worry if you lost the piece of paper with your census number on it. Just go to the website, you can fill it out. You don't have to have the ID number, and a second round of mailings will be sent out as well. So that's really what I want you to do. And then I also, if you have time, I'd love for you to take action and tell Congress to be vigilant about a fair and accurate count that includes transparency as we navigate the shifting waters of COVID.
Great, thank you again, all of you, for your wonderful insights and reflections on how we can be more faithful in this time of COVID-19 as we think about the 2020 elections and the 2020 census. I think you've done a really wonderful job of pointing out to us, why the COVID-19 pandemic actually amplifies the importance of the elections and the census. It doesn't diminish them. They're not far away things. They're very much related to all the things that we're struggling with right now. So thank you all and thank you for joining the conversation and being with us. And I hope that you will help carry this information and these opportunities for action out to your communities.
Thank you so much for all of you. To those of you who are watching right now or watching on the recording, I don't know about you, but I am already preparing my Facebook post to say, hey, I'm counted, are you? And how do I contact the right people to advocate for everyone being counted, not only in the census, but also in November and the elections that are upcoming. Here in Ohio, we have to get all our paper in today. So that's very, very at the tip of my awareness. So with gratitude for all of you for amplifying that. As we continue to move in this series, which is a part of the Thursdays for the Soul series, the next gathering is 2 days from now on Thursday, and we will be engaging ancestral practices of lament. And one of those things that I feel in my heart right now is what you were saying earlier, Christian, that people have to decide between their life and their vote when they go out, and that is worth lamentation. So holding that, and we will hold that up on Thursday as well. From here, I am going to pray us out. So if you can breathe with me and be in a spirit of prayer. To all that is holy, we lift gratitude for the folks on this call, for their work, for their continued vigilance. We lift gratitude for those who are learning what they can do. Inspire them, God, to help bring us closer to the world you vision for us. Help our common good really be in service to all of your beloved children. Hold us together and bring us ever closer to that just world for all people. I pray all this in your holy name. Amen. This webinar, that's a strange transition. This webinar and webinars like it are made possible by your donations. You can text to donate to the United Church of Christ Annual Fund to support programs like this by texting 41444 to that number, UCC. So go forth into this day blessed, not because of anything that you've done, but just because of who you are and who you are to the divine. Go forth and be blessed.